It was on the 15th of December, 1900, that three lighthouse keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, simply disappeared from Eilean Mor Lighthouse, situated on the largest of the 7 Flannan Isles, 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis in the northwest Atlantic. It was their job to tend to the light, protecting shipping from the treacherous rocks around the Hebrides. But that light had not been seen for a week or more. Now, according to official reports sent by Superintendent Robert Muirhead to the Northern Lighthouse Board on the 8th of January 1901, all three men had gone down to the West Landing on the Saturday afternoon, the 15th of December, to secure the box containing mooring ropes and to batten down the crane that was used to lift supplies from ships onto the island, when a huge roller unexpectedly hit them and swept them away. So this is what happened. End of story. Nothing more to be said. Or is there? This would be an easy explanation. A stormy sea, high winds, big waves, but there are so many strange inconsistencies. We need to take a closer look at it. Let's start with the lighthouse keepers themselves. The man with the most superiority was the principal lighthouse keeper, the PLK James Ducat. He was 44 years old, a married man with 4 children, having 22 years of experience of lighthouse keeping behind him. He had been keeper at several other lighthouses in his career, being promoted to PLK on the 2nd of May 1896. He moved to Eilean Mor just over 3 years later, in August 1899. And the second assistant was ALK Thomas Marshall, an unmarried man aged 29, who had 4.5 years' experience and would have been third in line of seniority, but because first assistant ALK William Ross, who should have been on duty at the time, was in fact ill and had been replaced by an occasional lighthouse keeper, Donald MacArthur. He actually became second in seniority. Now OLK MacArthur, a married man with 2 children, was reputed to have a volatile temper and didn't have much experience, only had been recruited by the NLB on the 29th of January of that year, and had only 26 nights of training. He was a former Royal Engineer, however, and was a well-respected member of the Free Presbyterian Church. The night before the disappearance, all seemed to be going to plan as usual. Robert Ducat had done the 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. watch and had retired to bed. MacArthur then took over, and presumably he had an uneventful night. He went out to the kitchen to get a cup of tea after checking all was functioning properly with the lights. He would have returned to the lantern room to make sure the mechanism was wound back to its starting point, thereby keeping the light turning. He would have sat sipping his drink, listening to the winds howling and the waves lashing against the island, alone, as both Ducat and Marshall would have been sound asleep. Even though there were 3 men inside Eilean Mor Lighthouse, it would have been a lonely job while on watch duty, but each man knew what his duties were and fulfilled them diligently. Nearly 2 a.m., MacArthur would have given his final check to everything in the lantern room, and then headed to Marshall's room to wake him for his 2 to 6 a.m. shift. Even though MacArthur was duty cook and had breakfast to prepare, for he decided to try and get a bit of sleep beforehand. Robert Ducat woke from Marshall's watch, ready for his breakfast no doubt, and after they all had eaten around 7 a.m, would have gone up to check everything, extinguish the light, draw the blinds, and refill the paraffin reservoir in readiness for night-time. A night-time for which those 3 lighthouse keepers would never happen. Marshall had gone back to bed after breakfast and got about 3 hours sleep before waking at 10 a.m. He decided to get up, and he had a chat with MacArthur while having a cuppa, and they went up to help Robert Ducat clean the lens in the lamp room, as he knew it wasn't a particularly nice job and was time-consuming. Lunch was prepared by MacArthur at 1 p.m, and while they were eating, Robert Ducat brought up the concern he had about the equipment, the box of ropes on the west landing, which hadn't been checked for a couple of days because of the bad weather. Robert knew that his employers, the NLB, would fine them if anything was damaged due to their neglect, and asked MacArthur if he would go with him through the checks. A bit of an argument ensued over this, and MacArthur refused, saying he had all the clearing up to do after lunch and also had preparations to make for tea. So after a bit of toing and froing, Robert Ducat and Marshall decided that they wouldn't have any peace of mind until they didn't go and check. At this point, they went outside to evaluate from a blowhole not far from the tower how the water was shooting out from it to determine the strength of the waves below. They watched for over half an hour and calculated that the waves were lessening and that it was best to go then and get the inspection over with. Robert Ducat didn't let MacArthur off the hook for not being willing to help though, and gave him an extra job of polishing the metalwork in the tower before he went for a nap, preparing for tea. Robert Ducat and Marshall donned their outside weather gear. Ducat in his sea boots and old waterproof coat, and Marshall in his proper oilskin and sea boots. The first thing they would have noticed was the twisted railings at the top of the rocky cliffs above the west landing area. Turf had been disrupted too, and both men would have been very alarmed at this. And as they made their way down the wet and slippery steps, they noticed some of the railings were intact, but others had been ripped from the foundations. Let's not forget the experience these two men had as lighthouse keepers, over 25 years between them. They were used to the voracity and unrelentingness of the sea, so they would have been treading carefully, very carefully indeed. They saw the lifebelt had been torn away, but the crane looked untouched. Unfortunately, a rope was snagged on a rock further down, and Marshall, who had been fined once before for loss of equipment, and was the younger man, said he would go down further to retrieve it. So yes, he was younger than Robert Ducat, but it was slippery, and the sea boots and heavy oilskin he was wearing were cumbersome. As he reached the rope, he appeared to lose his footing and fell back into the turbulent sea. Robert Ducat realized that with no lifebelt, he would be unlikely to be able to pull Marshall out on his own, so he raced back up the steps to get MacArthur. As they tried to reach him, all three men succumbed to the overwhelming power of the sea. Of course, all this is supposition. We do not know what happened, and we are never going to do. Experts can look at wave height, wind speeds, weather conditions, and sea disturbance, and we still won't know what actually happened. And all the aforementioned fits the evidence. What could have caused them to go out if the storm was raging? Why MacArthur didn't don his weather gear? Why all three of them disappeared together? And obviously, we cannot be certain that they did. But we simply do not know what is true and what is not. So now, let's look at everything else. From other ships' logs passing the Eilean Mor Lighthouse, the weather for the days of December the 12th to the 15th were recorded as unusually calm all across the Outer Hebrides. Ships' captains spoke of glassy seas and clear skies, and yet the island looked as if it had survived a hurricane. There were speculations about ghost ships, phantom lights, and a faked logbook supposedly recovered from Eilean Mor detailing despair, madness, and prayers with the words, "God is over all." And of course, all this was bolstered by local superstition. The island had long been revered as sacred ground, because a chapel had been built on it by Saint Flannan when he and his monks stayed there on a spiritual retreat. Local fishermen have said that they have always spoken hushed tones when sailing near the island, afraid that the dead might answer. Many locals felt the island was cursed, and this we will touch on later. If this were the case, it makes me wonder why some of the locals took their sheep there to graze, and why they would also take the risk of raiding the nests of the abundant seabird population of eggs, birds, and feathers. But I suppose needs overcome fear. And before we look at some of those speculations, consider the fact that the light from the lighthouse had not been seen for over a week. And a man named Roderick Mackenzie was paid £8 per year to keep a watch on the lighthouse using a powerful telescope. He was not only to check that the light was working on a night, but to watch for any emergency signals during the day. He hadn't seen the light flashing at night since the 7th of December, but he hadn't seen any emergency signals either, so wasn't too concerned, as this sometimes happened and had done so before due to the weather or atmospheric conditions. But he was starting to get worried by the 15th. At the same time, a ship named the SS Actor was returning to Leith after a regular run from Philadelphia. It was approaching midnight on the 15th of December, and the ship was sailing its way through dark cold waters around 5 miles from the Flannan Isles, with her captain, Francis Arthur Holman, scanning the horizon for Eilean Mor light, but all he saw was darkness. He knew he would have to report this on arrival at Leith, but unfortunately, not long after, the Archer struck the Carfree Rock and sustained major damage. Consequently, the damage to his ship became their priority over the lighthouse, but he did report it to the Archer's agents, Henderson and McIntosh, the day after. They in turn must have been more concerned about the condition of the ship, because they didn't relay the message to the NLB on the 28th, 10 days later. It was on the 26th of December that the tragedy was discovered. The Hesperus was finally able to reach Eilean Mor after being delayed by the weather at Loch Rogue on Lewis, carrying supplies, and also relief lighthouse keeper ALK Joseph Moore. They immediately noticed that the flag wasn't flying, which indicated to them that the keepers on the island hadn't seen the ship's arrival. They sounded the steamer's horn, but there was no response. And Captain Harvey ordered a signal rocket to be fired and the horn to be sounded again, but all to no avail. A rowing boat was sent out with a group of sailors, including the relief keeper. When it reached the west landing, Moore climbed the steep steps, leaving the other men in the boat. At the top, he saw no one, and the entrance gate was closed. So too was the door to the kitchen, closed but not locked. And the inner door was open, and he noticed that the fire had not been lit for quite a while. Moore then went to check the bedrooms and saw that the beds were just as they would have been left in the early morning. He must have felt very unnerved by all of this and rushed back to the rowing boat to get the other men to help search for the lighthouse keepers. And a telegram was eventually sent to the NLB and was received at 8:27 p.m, telling of a dreadful accident on the island. Superintendent Robert Muirhead took control of the situation and plucked 2 keepers from other lighthouses to join Eilean Mor to make sure the light kept protecting shipping passing the island. They arrived early on the 29th and saw that the last entry on the slate had been from PLK Ducat on the 15th of December. All the work had been completed. Lamp trimmed, canteens filled, lens cleaned, kitchen tidied, in fact everything, shipshape, except that 3 men had vanished into thin air. Unofficial reports were written, assumptions were made, and strangely no police involvement was asked for or received, and the running of Eilean Mor Lighthouse just carried on. So, had the men been blown into the sea by high winds, dragged into the unforgiving North Atlantic by gigantic waves? Or as a later lighthouse keeper on the islands, Walter Robert Adelbert, surmised that they had died as a result of trying to rescue a colleague who had fallen in? But I do wonder about the latter scenario, however, as would someone who was rushing outside in their shirt sleeves remember to close 2 doors behind them? I am not sure about that. What do you think? One later theory was that one of the keepers had run amok, gone berserk, and killed the other 2, and then presumably committed suicide. Preposterous, you may think, but maybe not. It was known to be a hard job being a lighthouse keeper, a lonely one too, being alone in the early hours of the morning in the lamp room with only your own thoughts and the sound of the wind and the sea to distract you. Maybe, just maybe, you have to be a little crazy to do the job, and anyway, it had happened before. Okay, I mean someone having a mental breakdown, that is, not actually killing anyone, but being out of control enough to have to be restrained until a relief vessel came to collect them, as they were threatening violence to the other keepers. So you see, it's not as far-fetched as we may think. And now we get to the supernatural stuff. One piece I found interesting was that when Joseph Moore first arrived at the lighthouse on the 26th of December on board the Hesperus, a story told by locals was that he saw 3 giant blackbirds sitting on top of the lighthouse tower who flew away and out to sea. This wasn't mentioned in his report to the NLB, but he had made it known to Superintendent Muirhead that he wasn't happy about being left there, and he could of course have told this story on his eventual return home as to the reason why. There were rumours of the men offending a race of pygmies that were believed to have lived on the Flannan Isles, or that they had been abducted by aliens. There is much folklore surrounding these islands, from kelpies to huge beasts washed ashore, but let's go back to the aspects of the island being cursed, as I mentioned earlier. When things go wrong in a place, it is generally considered to be bad luck or unfortunate coincidences, but Eilean Mor does seem to have had more than its fair share. During the lighthouse construction, the clerk of works suddenly died. Then just over a year later, the 3 keepers disappeared. Less than 48 hours after passing Eilean Mor, the SS Actor hit a rock and was severely damaged. But then weirdly, it had dissipated itself. On the 3rd of January 1912, it is presumed she sunk with all hands in bad weather in the North Atlantic, but again no proof, as she simply vanished. But that's not all, because another keeper, John McLachlan, fell to his death from the lighthouse tower in Eilean Mor on the 20th of August 1904. And then William Ross, remember him? He was the keeper who should have been on duty on that fateful night, but was too ill, and MacArthur took his place. He continued to work as a lighthouse keeper and was promoted to PLK on the 6th of September 1901 and was transferred to Eilean Glass Lighthouse. Just over 7 months later, he dropped dead in the light room. It was 1 year and 4 months to the day of the disappearance of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur on Eilean Mor. Thank you for listening. Until the next time.